Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubinstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Hi, welcome to Restoring the Culture. This is Camille and Tanya, and today we're going to be, I'm actually going to be interviewing Tanya on her decades-long work with story, and in our next podcast, she'll be interviewing me, and just want to let everyone know that we're going to be moving the podcast to twice a month, from weekly to twice a month, so that we can just put more time and energy and intention into the content. We'll also be inviting guests in to join us. And so we're really excited about the evolution of how this podcast is going. So Tanya, I'm so excited to talk with you about your story work. I have been really fortunate to have done some work with you and to watch you grow and evolve over the last 20 years or so. And so I'd love to have you start off by talking a little bit about what the story work you've shared on the podcast before about your mentor Spalding Gray, but it's sort of like what was the story like for you when you started doing story work in the beginning? Can you just sort of like capture that? Because I'd love to hear like how was it then, and how has the work evolved as you have evolved?
I love that, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm grateful that we're doing this and that I get to share with our listeners really my devotion to story. And next week that we'll be getting into your deep, long devotion. So it's a great question. So I would say it was abject terror for me when I began doing my story work. I remember being maybe 24 years old in New York City, and I'd met Spalding. But I was not liberated in my voice. My voice was very much tethered. I was terrified to be seen, though I longed for it so much. And I was so lonely. A lonely person, a lonely child. I think you know the first constellation I ever did, my biggest inquiry was, why have I been so lonely my whole life? So it was a pivotal question. So I had that ambiguity, and I found this with so many of my students and people I've worked with. It's this thing inside where we long to connect and be seen and be intimate and share our stories and be untethered in our voice. And yet it's terrifying. So this really came up for me. I mean, it took me about 10 years or 9 years after meeting Spalding to finally perform my first solo show. And when I came to Santa Fe, I did Natalie Goldberg's writing process. She'd just come out with Writing Down the Bones and Julia Cameron's Artist's Way, and those things really helped. But so I was practicing sharing stories at these little tiny baby steps. Like I'd share one little free write that was a paragraph long with like my friend Karen in our Artist's Way writing group. I was just terribly blocked by so much shame and so much silencing and so much like just trauma from the way I grew up. And I had this, it was like a Cohen inside me. Like, how can I speak? Because I'd spoken out as a child, and then by the time I was an adolescent, I'd become very shut down. And then more trauma occurred, and I became more and more shut down. So I never shared anything real, really, with people, or intimate or vulnerable. And I remember writing in my journal at that age, I so long to be able one day to share some of these thoughts in my journal with one other person, but I would be so ashamed. And I imagined that I would not be accepted and loved if I shared what was in my journal. So that feeling in me was also probably the impetus and drive, and why I was so blown away by Spalding Gray, and why I was so blown away by authentic storytelling. And he was that portal. So when I was 31, I finally was getting up on stage. I'd tried like 5 other times. I mean, I'd been an actor and hid behind other roles, not hid, but performed behind other roles. But my own story, I had scheduled, I had a script, I had the director, I had the theater, and I'll never forget the terror that came over me about a few weeks before. And I wanted to cancel so badly. And my ex-husband, I was just on the staircase sobbing, I cannot do this. And I wasn't anyone who'd experienced stage fright as an actor. It wasn't that. It was abject terror of exposing my personal intimate story. And I remember feeling so much fear on opening night. And opening night was like traumatic for me, but not because the people didn't respond beautifully and love it, because it literally took everything I had to get up there and move past my shame, my conditioned shame and trauma, family trauma, patriarchal trauma for sure, feeling defective my whole life, feeling very broken, and to speak and expose myself. I mean, I got standing ovations. I got, a great review. I got a not so great review. It was sold out. We extended the run. But the second weekend was the real test for me, because I just gotten a great review in the Santa Fe Reporter. So a bunch of people I didn't know came to see the show. And these men, I remember maybe 3 or 4 of them in the front row, they were just sitting with their arms crossed. And I was probably projecting on them. Like I felt like they were looking at me like, prove something to me. And from the first weekend, people had laughed at this particular part in the opening 10 minutes, and they didn't laugh. And I thought they looked stern, and I felt very judged. And what happened was I had this shame attack like I've never had in my entire life, on stage, alone, in a solo show, performing in front of 150 people in a sold-out theater. And the soles of my feet started burning, this heat. And the heat came all up my body, and I could feel it moving all the way through my face. I know my face was bright red, my chest. And I had this moment, even after being a professional actor and being trained that way, where I was literally going to stop the show. This thought went through my head: stop the show, give them all their money back, apologize, just get off the stage. So that was the level of terror. And I kept going through the shame attack, probably only because I had so many years of acting training, but it's a moment I've helped many of my clients with too, that moment of, there is no way I can have this lacerating self-exposure. It will kill me. That moment I felt like I was going to die of the shame. And when I didn't die, something broke open in me and was liberated, and it never shut back down.
I think it's so interesting, when you talk about if one other person could just hear my story, and you talk about being a lonely child, and we're dealing now with we're dealing with the isolation of the pandemic, but loneliness is becoming a health risk. I mean, it's increasing, right, in our culture. And I just find that there's this really interesting intersection between shame, loneliness, voice, and the human need to share. It reminds me of Peter Levine's work that he talks about in Waking the Tiger, and he uses this example of, right before an earthquake. They've done these studies in LA where goldfish can sense that an earthquake is coming before it's detected. And so one of the ways that they can tell that an earthquake is going to happen is when they see goldfish they come close together. And that's how they survive this potential trauma, is that they come close together. And I wonder how much of this speaks to the part of us that's a human animal that
Yes.
longs to come closer together. And I remember doing my show at the Lensic when we did the caregiver monologues. And I remember you and I used to talk about these bridges of feeling, bridges of compassion being built when people would be on stage and they would share their story. And that because we get to the point where there's only one story.
That's right.
I mean, my friend Michael Stillwater talks about the one great song, you know, that he's traveled the world and he does all of this work with the song that, you know, eventually comes back to this one song. Do you feel the same thing about story, that when you're working with clients and over the years that you've done that you feel that there's like an undercurrent of one story?
That's a great question. Thank you. And it's a complex answer. I think I think years ago I would have just said yes. But to me, in some ways, to me, the one story is the masculine now. The one story is the unified field. It's the sun. But to me, I'm more interested in the individual story, the individuation, because to me, that's the feminine. It's the humanity. It's the each precious voice matters. Each lived experience is seen and witnessed and heard. And in us coming together in this deeply individuated way, when we stand in our unique experience, our unique human experience, I believe it strengthens the community and the tribe. And I believe it's so much about this human collective experience of being together on earth. And to me, the one voice, yes, to me, that's the divine that runs under everything. But I think spiritual bypass happens when and looking at everything going on right now, right, around the issues coming up, around racism. As a queer woman, I feel this way. But no, I totally know what you're saying. I'm just saying, for me, the story work is really the human work. But yes, of course, we're all connected in the one great story. But I think I've become more interested in the specific expression of each story.
So it sounds like your work is about the process, right? It's not necessarily the final story.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely true. As a matter of fact, I realize, even though I've worked with so many people to finish their books, their solo shows, their business, work on their business and get that story out there about, to land their place in the world. What I realize underneath is, for me, it's all about listening to the broken pieces, the parts that have been left behind, the parts that have been stolen or borrowed, whether by the family system or the culture or the person's shame or sense of self-worth. So my process is about finding wholeness in the brokenness, I would say, in the shards and the fragments. And it's kind of messy work. And it's kind of it's the soul retrieval work. Those are the stories I'm interested in. And as I have gone deeper and deeper, in my life and my story process, that's where I've landed. And I feel very, very, not just comfortable, like I feel I'm in my right place there with those stories.
I think that's where our work really merges. And there's a lot of synchronicity between the work that you do and the work that I do.
Oh my gosh, totally. Total synergy, right?
Yeah. I guess I'm curious, like when you look back at sort of the early years of doing story work, is there anything that you don't do anymore that you did then that you're
yes. Yeah, totally. I mean, well, it's funny because it's like what gets validated in the world versus what is the deepest integrity in ourselves. So in the world, I got a lot of kudos for a lot of the early work I did with people. But there was like the cancer monologues, or I think when we worked with the Palestinian and Israeli girls, I was very controlling. And I was very controlling around what story I thought people should tell versus supporting them in what they most essentially needed to say. And it can be tricky work. I mean, there's real things, there's real things you want to look at in terms of tracking a story that's compelling for an audience to listen to or a reader to read. But then there's also honoring the process of what needs to be spoken. So I walk a razor's edge with that, but I really used to go in with more of an agenda. Over time, I've let go of the agenda, and I'm noticing, I mean, I was just on a call with 4 different women who are all my memoir clients on Friday, and I thought, my God, they are writing the stories of the new culture, and it's coming through them because I hold a much bigger kind of unflinching space now without agenda.
And how is that connected to you being in your own story at this time in your life? I guess it's 2 questions. You being in your own story, which is what I'm hearing, standing at the center of your own story. And also, how has that affected the loneliness? How has the loneliness that you experienced then, how has that changed?
Thank you. That's a great question, too. Well, I just wrote a Facebook post yesterday because it's Gay Pride, and I wrote a post about not coming out till I was 49 years old, and I'm 56 tomorrow, as you know. So even not fully coming out to myself, I think that I was always doing soul retrieval work with others so I could do it for myself ultimately. I don't think if I wouldn't have gone into, there was such an insatiable curiosity in me. There were so many things that were taboo to be spoken about in my family, my culture, the way I grew up, that were very cold. It was not a warm culture. It was cold and it was judgmental and it was right and wrong. And I think my story work, I kept choosing groups of people to work with, and then I started getting clients who I was so curious about how other people live their lives. And I was so afraid of things like cancer and HIV/AIDS. Then I did all that work with those people, and I learned that there was humanity there and there was love there. And I learned there was love there in the face of a father's suicide. I learned there was love in the face of being a trans person. I learned that in the telling of the story and that liberation, what really got liberated was love. And including hospice monologues, right? The liberation was love. So all of that work was to get to a place where I could be liberated, not just around my sexuality, but around my identity and my place in the world, which was not who I was raised to be on any level. And not just, again, about the sexuality, but this sense of queerness, beingness, not a binary thinker, didn't fit into binary education systems, all kinds of things. And to love my story now is to love my fate. It's to love it's to be in this body and love my life. And that has softened me, and it's brought bigger stories that have been laid at my feet, mostly now by my students and clients. But yeah, and it's made me fearless. It's so funny. So that young woman, 31 years old, when I did Honeymoon in India, was so terrified to be seen. It was so easy for me to write a Facebook post. I just sat down and wrote kind of a long, intimate post about how long it was coming out and about being married to a transgender man and my confusion about my sexuality and marrying and divorcing straight men, and then having affairs with women. Some people would consider that extreme, vulnerability or transparency. Like, why would you go there? Well, all that came back to me was so much love. And that's what I've learned now. And I don't feel any shame when I speak about most things now. I'm not that ambiguity about being visible. It's not that there aren't threads of it that are still there, but I don't have to walk through a minefield of shame and terror now to access my voice, what we were just talking about, voice, my story. And so the way I'm able to hold space for others now is much more effortless. Not only do I not have an agenda, It's a much bigger, deeper, broader space, and it supports them in their excavation and retrieval more quickly. And it's even amazing around structure, because we can be very heavy-handed in Western culture right around, this is the structure. And I always had such hard times with structure. And so I worked extra hard for my clients to always give them a structure, give them a framework, give them options. And what's evolving now is in that bigger space, more organic structures are coming up for all their books. And my business clients too, around story, it's kind of like they're finding their organic structures, and those can be individual too. So I'm learning that frameworks, while necessary to move the progression of a story along, can also be non-binary. And they don't just have to be hero's journey or heroine's journey or transformational arc or hit all those marks. They too can be fragments and shards. And sometimes they are very much a heroine's journey. It depends how my clients' brains work. And the thing is to not judge the way any particular story wants to express. So there's more inner and outer diversity now in story form, as I've accepted my own inner diversity, which was something I didn't have access to 25 years ago.
Well, and that's what I'm hearing, is going back to the question about loneliness, is that it sounds like you are companioning yourself now, that through your story work and work with shame, that you have become your own companion. And then it takes me to so many of our conversations about what really is true leadership. And I think true leadership happens when we do the deep work of becoming our own companion, right? And that's the authentic expression that like no one can teach us. And it is about self-acceptance and self-compassion and self-love, so that we can also like share that with others. And as I'm listening to you, I'm also experiencing how much you've become a leader of who you are in your life and with others, and that really is leadership, right? Leadership really is about becoming the authentic version of yourself and being able to accept yourself fully, so that you can bring that out into the world. Because otherwise, what we're doing when we follow leaders, it's like we're following the recipe, we're following the half-life, the half-life, and that never ends well. It doesn't take us onto a path of wholeness. I'm going through some of that right now, where I'm seeing leaders that, for all of their brilliance and all of their hard work, there's still a half-lifeness about it, because there's been a buy-in to this culture that really doesn't want us to come from love. That really still needs to come from doubt and punishment and shame in its own way in order to have some kind of rite of passage, right? That and I'm not saying suffering isn't part of the human process, but I think what I've seen you do with your stories is to flip that also upside down on its head, so that you allow for the love to become the leadership model, as opposed to the hierarchical leadership model of approval, disapproval, which is judgment. And it does. I mean, I think judgment, it's so the foundation for so much that keeps us bound in our own stories, right? That leads to shame. But I guess what I'd love to do now is I'd like for us to kind of like move forward. And I'd like to talk about like what you're doing now and where you see yourself going with your story work. Because you're now working with people, with entrepreneurs. I mean, it's shifted, right, from taking these themes of like the Israeli-Palestinian monologues and cancer monologues and the caregiver hospice monologues, and you've done work with veterans, and you've really worked with some really incredible populations. And now it seems like you're really focusing on, it's like almost feels to me like an empowerment process for restoring the culture, right?
Yeah. I feel like I'm restoring everything right now. So, I'm working with entrepreneurs, yes. And I'm working with, my clients now are so diverse, right? I'm just thinking I have one woman who's the head of a huge international organization who will likely have a very high profile book. I have one woman in Europe who is a an escort, who works with politicians. There are taboo stories. I still fall into different worlds, and people find me. I believe, to be accepted in their brokenness and turn the shards into their wholeness, because that's what I've done.
Do you ever find that people are so married to the brokenness that they can't go with you on that arc of transformation?
Yes, and less, because I'm able to lean into the love of them, and in that holding space of really deep love, whether their shame's coming up or their stuckness or they're projecting on me a little bit, it just doesn't stick to me the way it used to. So I don't take it personally. So a lot of movement is happening, although every now and then people self-select out of the container. Energetically or vibrationally, they just can't hold with the love and they have to go away. It's too confrontive, like to the ego. And I understand that. I've been there where I've just been like, it's been too confrontive to my ego. Mm-hmm. But what I'm thinking about as we talk about leadership, and I've been working with some of my entrepreneurs, some of these women in these very matriarchal women's circle, and they love working with you and they love working with my marketing person. I work with them on their stories, but I've been talking about, I hate the word branding, like to brand ourselves. So we've decided to call it unbranding storytelling. And right now, I think when I'm referring to leadership, it's like unleadership. It's like unschooling. I don't want to do anything to do with the way leadership or branding has been, or even storytelling, frankly, even writing a book. It's like the process is an unlearning. It is not, and it is an unlearning so that people can be liberated in a deep sense of authenticity and step into it, because everything's been tainted by toxic capitalism and by branding and by white supremacy and all of these things that are non-Indigenous. You were just talking about Indigenous leadership in organizations, how it's been taken out, non-Indigenous to our nature. So an unprocess, an unlearning, to me is where it's at, so that the stories that want to be freed, that want to be liberated, the stories that want to lead, that come through me, the stories that want to serve others, that come through me. So that process is about this radical untethering. Yeah, so I see my work going towards unleadership and sort of even with the non-binary stories, right? Looking at structures like telling a story of potency and power.
Well, because the truth is bigger than like when we use a word like leadership, right? Truth is so much bigger than that.
So much bigger.
And it's inclusive. And I remember when I was in 2008, when Solace Wisdom of the Dying, my film was, came out in Santa Fe, it premiered. And I followed that with a talk that I gave, and there were a bunch of nurses, hospice nurses in the audience. And I remember I started talking then, and I had a title to a talk that was called Unnursing.
I love
back
that.
in 2008,
yes.
because really to be with dying people, you had to learn how to unnurse, because
just
so
be
much
present,
of it
right?
is being present and being full enough in yourself that you can hold space for the fullness of someone's death, right? And that you're not going to rush in and try and fix something, or you're not going to be all about the doing, right? Which is so much about happens in nursing and medicine, is that it's all about the intervention. And this is the opposite, right? Not that you don't ever,
use a skill set. If you're working on a book, you've got to know how to write a chapter, or what your themes are, where you're moving. But exactly, there's some skill sets that come into any practice, any deep practice, particularly those with some kind of outcome. But I love that you did unnursing and death. To really surrender to the story that wants to come through is more of a dying process at times than a birthing.
I think that's absolutely right. So in a way, restoring the culture is also unstorying the culture, and it's restoring the unculture.
Yeah, I love that. That's it. Restoring the unculture inside ourselves.
That's right. That's right.
And then it translates right to the whole world around us.
Well, and as we talk about really the word culture, when I think about it, it takes me then to the microbiome in the gut. That's
totally.
That's our true enculturation, right? The culture that affects how we think and feel, that is also the majority of our immune system. And it's what we talked about before the podcast and this, work that I'll be talking about on the next podcast, which is how do we move that knowledge from the microbiome down, not up, where we always want to go up into the head. How do we move it down to our feet and connect with the wisdom of the earth and the voice of the voiceless? And I think that's maybe this is a good place probably for us to wrap up, but here's where our work is once again coming together, which is finding the voice of the voiceless in the story.
Yes.
And that we're restoring, which is a process of unstoring, unculturing. And anyway, it's just, I'm so excited for you with your work, and I'm grateful to be involved in it and grateful for your friendship. And I'm just want to wish you such a happy birthday.
Thank you, Camille.
And so grateful to be on this life journey with you for so many years.
Oh, me too. So grateful and so much learning. And the great thing, right, like you're talking about the unstorying, the storing and going deeper and deeper, the beauty of it is to know it's endless. And it always has something new to teach us about ourselves and about this, it's just unraveling the mystery.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, thank you for taking the time
to
speak about story with me today. I look forward to our next one.
Me too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restoring the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restoring the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.